When someone says the term the burning times, what comes to mind? Witchcraft, witches, the Inquisition, witches being burned at the stake, all things that tend to come to mind. I'm here today to talk about the history of witchcraft. I have a brief booklet on a history of witchcraft that's available for order. If you would like, you can message me through here or in my various ways that I'll post down below. But the burning times actually refers to a decade, 10 years. It's not to say that the persecution of witches did not start way before then and go on quite far after that, for sure. But the burning times, the official time is from 1560, 1550 to 1560. That's when you hear the burning times, that's what history is referring to. 1550 to 1560. And it's kind of around a time when the burning of witches at the stake were in its height. It actually started, the persecution of witches, in 975 AD, and it went to the last witch being hung in 1782. So I'm going to go over some of the highlights of some of what's in this book. And like I said, there's more to it and more information. If you want to order the book, you're welcome to. But I feel it's important to always know where you've come from. So a lot of people today, practice witchcraft or Wiccan, and they don't always know their own history. So I'm going to start with that, and I'm hoping to do some more videos on the introduction to witchcraft, and I'll be having more advanced witchcraft videos on my Patreon channel as well. So those will be available shortly. They're not up there yet, but they will be soon, in the next few months coming up. So please do check out my Patreon channel if you're interested in more advanced kind of witchcraft as well. I'm Rhonda Devlin Gilbert, and I'm Lady Rose also. I've been practicing witchcraft for probably a little over 30 years now. I've gone down many, many paths. I started out in Druidism, moved over to Wicca, and then over to witchcraft. And I've kind of incorporated a lot of these things, because a lot of these things, once you are into them, you find out that there's actually more similarities than there are differences. I grew up as a very strict Catholic, so ritual is sort of in my blood. I'm what I like to jokingly refer to as an Irish Indian, so I'm part Irish and part Mohawk of the Iroquois Nation of the Bear Clan. So I have a lot of different history in my own background as well. But I'm going to start with sort of what's called the birth of magic, where it kind of came from and why it was around, because I want to talk about the goddess age. Because when we first started embracing religion or magic or practice ritual into our lives, a lot of it was very goddess based. Part of this is, the theory is that because women could bring life into this world, and perhaps man didn't fully understand it at first, how this came to be. I mean, eventually they figured it out, but we still, even to this day, are the ones that bring life into the world. And back when we were nomadic tribes after the ice ages, and Earth was volatile, and there was a lot of danger, not just from other tribes but from animals, and it was life just to survive, to find out where the food sources were and things like that. So man did two things. One, he revered women big time, because we brought life into the world. And the very important thing about that was, by bringing life into the world, women were growing the tribes. We were making them bigger, we were making them stronger, we were providing people for labor to hunt or gather, and we were also providing safety in numbers. So that was very important. And for that reason, we were very honored and revered and protected. The other thing that we did when early man was around was we studied the animals. We studied them for many reasons. Because we'd gone through some very dangerous, volatile times, by studying the animals, we were able to find out where safe water sources were, where food was perhaps. We were also able to figure out, well, we had to follow the herds anyways for food. And we also found out, what weather patterns were happening, because animals tend to sense weather and they're more sensitive to it than we are. So we found out what the weather patterns were, when perhaps catastrophic events were about to happen, because we could sense it in the animals or see the pattern change in the animals. So it was good to study those and to figure that out. We honored the animals as well. We wanted to have that successful hunt, so we would wear their furs and their antlers, and we would dance around the fires. And a lot of the times the dances around the fires were celebrations of a successful hunt, celebrations of an upcoming successful hunt. So what early man was doing was manifesting. We were wearing the furs and the skins and the horns of the animals that we were about to hunt, and we were celebrating that we were going to be having a successful hunt as if it had already happened. We would act it out. One person would play the hunter and, kill the deer or the antelope or whatever it was, and around the fires we would act out a successful hunt because we were manifesting it to be there already. So we were already starting to practice that magic and manifestation in life, that witchcraft. We also understood that we were connected to man to animal. We understood and we respected the fact that by killing the deer or the buffalo or whatever we were going after, they were making a sacrifice. I know from my native traditions, we still believe that animals make the sacrifice for us to be able to sustain our life and to feed us. And thus we go back to the earth when we die in order to feed them. And it's all connected, it's all a circle kind of thing. So that often is referred to as sympathetic magic or low magic. It's not better or worse. I'm sure you've heard of high magic and low magic, and in the introduction to witchcraft, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But that's what's considered sympathetic magic, or sometimes referred to also as low magic. And they became rituals. And as we grew, we got into the Egyptian times, and magic, in rituals became a very important thing. There were, and a lot of the rituals that are in even modern day religions, probably if you look back further, and when you do, have some aspect of shamanic practice in them. And that's what we were practicing too, with the sympathetic magic. It was very shamanic and that sort of thing, right? And as civilization evolved, according to archaeological evidence in Mesopotamia, it spread from the east into India and west into Egypt, and religions developed in which magic played a central part. Both magic and religion depend on ritual. It's all about the ritual, right? And the religions of ancient Egypt, classic Greece, and ancient Rome, and those of the Celtic world and the Scandinavian countries, all had magic in some form at their roots. If you look way back, there's magic in almost all those kind of areas. So it's said that magic doesn't really have any homeland. However, ancient Egypt is said to be magic's cradle. In ancient Egypt, magic was actually referred to as a hike, H-I-K-E, like walking. But the hike was actually a spoken formula that had to be said exactly the same way in order to produce whatever it is you needed to change or to create or whatever. And there even were gestures and acts that went with these spoken forms. So it sounds a lot like a mass, a Catholic mass, for instance, or a spell, or even a prayer, like the Our Father. It's the same words all the time. No one redoes the Our Father. They say it the way it's supposed to. And part of the theory is that the more something is done in a repetitive way, whether it's a prayer, that's why there's power in prayers and power in groups of people saying prayers or spells together, because you're saying those same words over and over and over again, and you're creating energy behind those words. So when they've been said over and over in the same way for hundreds or thousands of years, they have a power or an energy behind them. And then when you get groups of people repeating and chanting those words over and over again, it creates an energy. I mean, we do it naturally. Even when, for instance, when we go on strike, we create our own chants. When we go to a sports event, there's often chanting that's involved to help our team win, kind of thing, because we're trying to create that energy of, winning, or whatever it is we're trying to manifest. At a sporting event, we're trying to manifest our team winning. So the Germanic and Scandinavian tribes and the Celtic pagans honored a lot of the same things, like rivers, trees, plants. They believed that there were spirits in each of these things: the wind, the sun, the moon, and there was energy behind all of them. Now, for modern day witchcraft and Wicca, the Celtic people actually play a very important role, because their influence the modern paganism big time. A lot of your holidays and high feast days and your rituals and your spells come from the Celtic people. Modern magic rituals and spells have roots in Celtic times, dating back from 700 BC up until 100 AD. Now, a lot of it was lost because a lot of it came from the Druids, and the Druids were an oral community. They did not believe in the written word. It took 20 years of hard study to become a Druid, and it was all done orally. So that's a lot of studying. And also the Celtic people were a matriarchal society, so they actually had a lot of modern day beliefs and they still believed in the mother goddess. And when the Catholic Church tried to come in and convert them all, they refused to give up some of their gods and goddesses, the big one being Bridget. She's a triple goddess. And so they actually canonized a Saint Bridget in order to get the Celtic people to kind of convert to Christianity. So they incorporated her in. And it wasn't until about 300 years later that there actually was a real Saint Bridget. Up until that point, there wasn't really a Saint Bridget. They had just canonized a Saint Bridget because they wanted the Celtic people to convert. But their society overall, unlike the Catholic Church at the beginning, was about equality. So women could own property. When you had a child, the child took on the mother's name or the mother's tribe name. They were equal as far as, there were druidesses. There was no hierarchy as far as druid or druidess, like man and woman both could become druids. They were allowed to own property, which was sort of an unheard thing before then. And they were allowed to go into occupations that typically other societies wouldn't necessarily have allowed a woman to go into. One of those occupations was being a warrior. So that's why it was very hard for, it was a contributing factor as to why Rome couldn't conquer England and Ireland very well, because when they went into those countries, first of all, they're islands, so it's hard to get there, but also too, when they faced each other on the battlefield, there was a woman suddenly, and it created an element of surprise, like, oh, you're a woman. And they were able to often not be able to conquer the Celtic people because of that, because they kind of pulled back a little bit. And like I said, that element of surprise gives you that, fractions of seconds that make all the difference. So women were warriors right along with the men. They were buried with their armor and swords when they died. They went to a place called Summerland, which is what is the witch's heaven basically nowadays. So they've been using that term for a very long time. So like I said, it was a very equal society in the Celtic world. And like I said, many of your Sabbats and your high festivals are actually Celtic based. So around 2,000 years ago, a little over 2,000 now, in Palestine, the Christian religion was born, the one where we follow Christ. And the way the society worked a lot back then, and for many, many centuries, the way it worked was whoever was in charge, whether it's an emperor or king or queen, whatever religion they were, the country was as well. So for instance, in Rome, Christianity really caught on once the Emperor Constantine converted. He converted in 370 or 337 AD on his deathbed. And whatever the emperor was in those days, the rest of Rome had to be. So he was kind of the first emperor that converted to Christianity, and that's kind of when throwing the Christians to the lions ended, and Christianity really had a stronghold then, because suddenly all of Rome, which was considered a very powerful empire and city, was all Catholic. Just like, in England, when I'm reading a novel right now about the times when they would go back and forth between being Protestants and being Catholics. There's Queen Mary, Bloody Mary as she's sometimes called, who was Catholic, and all of England was now Catholic, and it was considered wrong to be Protestant. But then I believe it was her sister, Queen Elizabeth, came into power after her, and she was Protestant. So then England switched to being Protestant, and this was all after Henry VIII, who created the Anglican Church, because he wasn't allowed to be divorced from his wife according to the Catholic religion. So he created his own church, the king, and he became the head of the church in England. So that after him, some of the monarchies that sat on the throne went back and forth. Some were Catholic, some were Protestant. There was a real vie for power during that time. And while Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, she actually wanted tolerance. She didn't want people to die for the religion, but she was Protestant. So a lot of the people felt they should change to Protestantism. The Catholics had to pay a fine to go to church. They weren't being burned necessarily, but some were being killed, definitely. And then there's, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic, who wanted to take the throne from England and change England back to a Catholic country. And same thing was happening in some of the countries in Europe as well, France and Spain. And Spain was a very Catholic country and had a lot, it was the richest country, and had a lot of push as far as Catholicism goes. So the people of England sometimes had switched back and forth, and in other countries in Europe. So it's like, whatever the head of the country is, that's what we are, kind of thing. And sometimes it was under fear of death. You would actually be killed for practicing your religion, whatever it was. There was not tolerance in the way that we sort of have it today. I mean, there's intolerance today, definitely. But we've come a long way. Let's put it that way. So some of this history related to witchcraft. So I'm giving you a lot of history here. The popes are always involved. So in 540 to 604 AD, Pope Gregory I was in charge. He was the pope. And the popes in those days had huge, huge influence. And he decreed that he tried to increase the power of the Catholic Church, as many popes before him did. And he baptized tens of thousands of people into the Catholic Church. Sometimes they were coerced under threat of harm or torture to do this. So he realized that a lot of people will just say, yeah, okay, I'll convert to Catholicism, and then go back to the ways that they always do things. And he didn't want that. And he knew they would go to the places where they would worship. So he's the first pope to kind of come across this idea of, let's start building churches where their sacred sites are, where the groves are, where, things like that are. And a lot of the pagans, they believed in what's called the Great All. So the Great All is the Lord and the Lady. So you probably recognize the Lord and the Lady, or the God and Goddess on your altar. You probably had them there, referred to them, whatever it might be. So Pope Gregory I started building churches on sites where they came, usually in forests or whatever, to worship the Lord and the Lady, and especially the Lady, because again, it was still very much a goddess-based religion. And that's where Our Lady in the Catholic Church kind of comes from. I mean, it does come from the mother of Jesus, Mary, and refers to the Virgin Mary when we speak of Our Lady of Lourdes or Our Lady of wherever or whomever, or Our Lady of Sorrows or whatever. But the term Our Lady, what the Catholic Church was kind of doing was trying to appeal to the pagans they were converting, because they also referred to their goddess as Our Lady. So by doing that, they, created space where they were going anyways and just changing it to a Catholic format. And for many hundreds of years, there was still candles and altar items that were found that weren't part of the Mass that the pagans had brought in, because they were still worshiping there, and they were still worshiping some of their old gods and goddesses as well. So a lot of the local beliefs kind of got infused in with the Catholic rites and the Catholic dogma, because as the church grew, of course, it's harder to maintain such a large organization. So little pockets would start to pop up of, this is the Catholic stuff, but here's some of the local beliefs or whatever layered over top. That's the reason we kind of have Easter with Easter bunnies and eggs. What does that have to do with the crucifixion and rising of Jesus? It's like, that's some of the pagan stuff being layered over top. There was also a fusion in the New World too, when the slaves came over, and they brought their own religion. A lot of them brought a voodoo religion was the big one that came over. But a lot of people, when you think slaves during slave times, a lot of people forget that Native Americans were also slaves. You automatically think of the African American or the Africans that were brought over against their will, but also too the Native Americans were enslaved against their will. So another religion, or well, not a religion, a practice actually, that was a fusion of a bunch of different religions was the Native American spirituality, the voodoo religion that was brought over by the Africans, and the Catholic, or sometimes Christian, but more often than not, the Catholic religion, were all fused together to create what is now known today as hoodoo. And it was partly because the Africans came over. They still wanted to practice their own practices and their beliefs and rituals, as one does. And of course, they're in a whole new continent, so not a lot of their practices and rituals were around plants, the use of plants and things like that. So the plants weren't the same here, of course, in North America. So the Native Americans often advised the Africans, what plant are you looking for? What is it that you need it to do? Here's the Native North American version of that plant. So a lot of the herbal remedies and are a fusion of both African and Native American, because here's the replacement for the plant that you want for your African traditions. Oh, and here's some Native traditions that we use, and it's like, and then they all get combined together. And also too, they had to keep that practice and religion and ritual that they were doing secret, because they would be punished, of course, because again, much like countries, whatever your master was generally what you were expected to be. And if your master was Catholic, then you were expected to practice the Catholic religion. So a lot of it got fused together and then hidden in a Catholic coat, so to speak. So that's why in hoodoo you find that there's novenas, that the rosary is used, that a lot of saints are used, because the saints kind of replaced the gods and goddesses that they were using, or the spirits that they were using as Africans or Native Americans. And so that's why you find a lot of very Catholic beliefs or rituals in the hoodoo practice. So it's very interesting how these kind of all come together. So the term pagan actually was coined sort of in 400 AD, and the church used it to refer to country dwellers. That's kind of where its roots come from. It's a Latin term, pagani, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I hope I am. And like I said, it refers to the country dwellers because they were actually the last to kind of convert to Catholicism or Christian type religions, because they weren't in contact with the city as much. They were a little more isolated. They hung on to their beliefs a little longer. They wouldn't let certain things go. And, you know, they didn't see the need for change. In the 10th century, there was a canon issued by the Catholic Church telling men to abstain from heathen songs and devil's games during feast days, because they still celebrated a lot of the high feast days. That's why a lot of the church holidays land in with those high feast days. Like, Jesus wasn't actually born on Christmas. I think scientifically they've proven he was born sometime in March, if you look at the calendar. But they celebrate his birth at Christmas because there were a lot of pagan holidays. The winter solstice, Saturnalia, going way, way back. This is a time, Christmas was a time of year for celebration. And it was a celebration, for the most part, across the board, of the light coming back, of the sun coming back, of the sun being born again. Because up until that point, as far as the sun and the moon and the earth are concerned, the days are getting shorter. So we're celebrating that we don't go into complete darkness and that the sun is coming back. Thus, the Son of God was born at Christmas, right? So that's how they, and a lot of our traditions from Christmas are very pagan based. But also, too, it was during this time that this canon was issued, where, you know, don't sing the heathen songs, don't do the devil's games during feast days, go to the Catholic traditions, and things such as pitchforks and brooms became demonized. Because they were used a lot by country folk, of course. And there is a ritual that, a very old ritual that I read about, where the country folk, not witches, country folk will go out and bless the crops, and they would run around the crops with their brooms and do this blessing dance and that sort of thing. So that's why the broom kind of became a symbol of witches, because of course they were then accused of being heretics and witches and that sort of thing. So in 700 AD, the Christian writer and missionary Alcuin announced that there was no hope of converting the Danes to Christianity. So this is kind of funny because the church spread out all over Europe and was trying to convert everybody. But he said that their king was harder than stone and wilder than any beast. The Nordic people rejected Christ, viewing him as a Roman god, whom they refused to give their allegiance to, and preferring their older native deities. So I thought that was kind of interesting that, you know, when the church first went up into the Nordic places of Europe and whatnot, that the people kind of saw Jesus as a Roman. You're just bringing us one of your Roman gods. We shall not worship him. We're going to stick with our own gods. Seems reasonable. And then in 975 AD, penalties for witchcraft. So this is when witchcraft kind of started being punished and being looked for. There wasn't an inquisition yet at 975 AD, but the church was deeming, they first called us pagans, and then they started calling us witches, and witches became that demonized thing that was breaking down the church and an enemy of the church kind of thing. So the penalties in 975 AD and uses of healing magic, because the church wanted control over both the educational system and the healthcare system, were actually, but they were relatively mild in that day. So by later comparison anyways, there was no death penalty yet. The English confessional of Egbert said in part, if a woman works witchcraft, and it was often women that were targeted, because there were, I'm going to give you another stat in a minute here, and it's quite like, oh, that's kind of shocking. So if a woman works witchcraft and enchantment and uses magical filters, she shall fast for 12 months. If she kills anyone with her magic, she shall fast for 7 years. So that's the punishment. Either you're going to fast for 12 months, or if they find that you've killed someone because of your magic, you're going to fast for 7 years. Now, fasting in those days meant bread and water, and that's it, and not a lot of it. It's like once a day you get bread and water, and that's it. So it was a pretty harsh, but it wasn't a death penalty yet. So like I said, as the church grew, it kind of couldn't control everything, although it wanted control of everything. So it found that sometimes people were putting their own beliefs and mashing it together. So to discourage this, and to sort of enforce the official dogma of the church, because not everyone followed what the church deemed as the right path. So they started sort of employing people, priests and bishops for the most part at the start, to watch out for this, and that you could be accused and branded a heretic. And if they didn't recant their accusation, they were imprisoned and sometimes at that point put to death. Now at this point too, once we get into the later stages, like into the 1500s, there was a lot of, like I said, the burning times refers to 1550 to 1560, but also during the, from about 1520 or so till the later 1500s, there were whole villages just slaughtered for being Protestant or for being Catholic, depending on who was in power, right? So there was a lot of Protestant Catholic battles happening, as well as witchcraft accusations and people being accused of being heretics and things like that. So there's a very famous bull that came out. So bull, B-U-L-L, is a proclamation by the church, and it is what's deemed as infallible and is what God wants, and it is considered wrong to go against it, kind of thing. It's the Pope that always issues a bull, and so it comes from the office of the Pope. So in 1484, Pope Innocent the Eighth, there were a lot of Innocents, Pope Innocent the Eighth issued a bull concerning witchcraft. Now, he wasn't the first pope to do that, but what made the difference for him was that the printing press had just been invented. So his bull in 1484 about witchcraft became very popular, because up until that point, any bull that was issued had to be handwritten out by monks. That's what the monks did a lot of. They were scribes, and they would handwrite out this bull and hand it out to as many bishops and whatnot that they could, and hopefully it would filter down. But again, it was oral at that point, right? Except for the few copies of the bull. So, like I said, in 1484, there was the printing press that got created by Gutenberg. So Gutenberg had created this, and suddenly it was, like a photocopying machine. Wow, we can print out like so many copies so much faster. Once they set the type, it's just print, print, print kind of thing. And that's why reading was considered a rich man's game. One, because they could afford the education. So a lot of poor people didn't read, they were illiterate because they couldn't afford the education. And two, because books were considered very valuable, because books, again, also were handwritten and hand bound. So think of a book and think of how long it would take you to write your average novel, right? Like even this would take a while to hand write. It's not like they were, big volume amounts of these books around. So really only the wealthy had it, and not always the wealthy, like merchant wealthy. I'm talking like wealthy, royalty wealthy, privileged parts of society had books. The church had books because it was the monks that were scribing them, right? So it made all the difference in the world. It made a difference as far as royal proclamations, bulls coming from the church, but it also revitalized the interest and curiosity in magic, because now more of that could be printed as well. So in the bull, it was insisted that it was every Catholic's duty to help the Inquisition, because that's when the Inquisition kind of got started. His inquisitors to search out witches. So this bull that came out actually encouraged two monks. You might recognize these names, Henrik Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. Hope I'm saying that right. But they're the ones that created, now this is in Latin, I'm going to translate it to English because I know it in English, Malus Maleficarum. Don't know if I'm saying that right. But what that is, what their book is that they created that is very famous, is The Witch's Hammer. And The Witch's Hammer is a book that these monks created, and then they published and got it printed and distributed to other people that they recruited as inquisitors. And it was how to discover a witch. So it was all about how to discover a witch, what witches did. It was basically a witch hunter's manual, and it was, how to do an investigation, torture, how to run a witch trial, step-by-step instructions. What to look for in a witch. None of it true, of course, but this is what their beliefs were, and this is, like I said, it became the manual that every inquisitor used to discover and persecute and execute witches. So for the most part, women would get accused. For the most part, it was women, and then would be tortured, and because they would have to admit that they were witches, and so they were often tortured. A lot of them were sleep deprived, and there were other ways of torturing them, of course. In Germany, there was the famous what's called the witch's chair. So the woman would be sat down, usually exposed in some way on a chair with a metal seat, and then a fire would be lit under that seat, and of course it would get very hot, and she would not be allowed off the chair, and she was strapped in, and she would not be allowed off the chair until she admitted that she was a witch. So, a lot of these confessions were not real confessions, obviously. And then there's the famous swimming the witch, which just is ridiculous if you actually hear, what's going on and the test of what swimming the witch is. Now, a lot of villages had this apparatus. I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but basically it was you threw a witch in to the water, and if she sunk and drowned, she was innocent, but if she floated and lived, she was guilty. So either way, you were going to die. It's like, great. You do not want to be accused of being a witch in these days, because it was a very dangerous time. So it was actually not until 1150 AD, so we've moved up from 975 to 1150 AD, that burning became the most popular way of execution for heresy in Germany and France. It was thought that the flames would purge the spirit of sin so that the sinner could return to God in a purified state. Now, it wasn't just witches, it was also heretics that were burned, let's be fair. And this belief may have come from the East, they say, where cremation after death carried the soul to the afterlife. So burning became a popular way. There were lots of other ways that they could be killed, but for heretics and witches, that was often a way. If your executioner was kind, he would strangle you before you got burned, because actually burning someone at a stake is not pleasant to be around, even as an observer. And sometimes people just couldn't take the screams and whatnot. They were very brutal back then. Not everyone got strangled. Some of them just got burnt, and that to me is just heinous. Sorry, I need to wet my whistle after talking about burning. So also too, during the Black Death was kind of a big time for when witches kind of became the evil, because they were the scapegoat for why Black Plague was spreading and killing everyone. You know, they wanted to blame somebody. So they started to blame witches and the pagan traditions and rituals and the traditional cures. And a lot of these cures and a lot of these rituals involved washing and cleaning yourself, your hands, that sort of thing. The washing and cleaning actually got banned by the church because it was considered too worldly and vain. And it was considered a sin of vanity to clean yourself. St. Francis of Assisi, love him because he's all about animals, but he actually took pride in the fact that he only had, I think, 1 or 2 baths in his entire life, because it was a sign of humbleness to not take a bath. I'm just like, no, sorry, that's just not right. So because washing and cleaning was banned by the church, the Black Plague then just went on fire across, communities, villages, and countries, because of the lack of hygiene. And they thought it was, a holy thing. And it's like, oh, so not. Anyways, so witch trials from 1500 to 1700 AD. So between 1500 and 1700 AD, the church committed extreme genocide of witches all over Europe. Historical estimates, here's the stat I was talking about earlier. Historical estimates suggest that over 40,000 women were burned alive. That doesn't count the ones that were hung. So that's kind of scary. In an attempt to completely exterminate the goddess religion, because it was very goddess-based, a lot of the religions. Children were also sometimes slaughtered with their mothers because they believed that they were the seed of these witches. And daughters and infants were often just thrown on the fire with their mothers, which is horrific. Boys, however, were sometimes spared if they were over 5 years old. But they had to denounce their mother publicly in order to save their own life. So that's just contributing even more to the patriarchal society. And you wonder where some of these attitudes and these views sometimes come from, right? Like that's a horrible thing. Now, as far as, the signs of a witch, any mole, freckle, or blemish could be considered the mark of the devil. So, you can't control that a lot of the time. So, really? And it's not like they had sunscreen back then. Any individuality, disability, or sexuality was seized upon. So, of those 40,000 women, or 40,000 people, actually, that were burned at the stake, 100 of them were men. The rest were women. And like I said, that doesn't include the ones that were hung. So that's a lot of people, a lot of people. Generally, witches were hung in England. England was considered kinder somehow. They were burned in Scotland, though. The Witchcraft Act of 1541 declared the death penalty for witches, and though the punishment was lessened to imprisonment in 1736. So 1541, the Witchcraft Act came into play, and yes, it was death for if you were considered a witch. In 1736, like I said, it was lessened to imprisonment. How kind. And the law itself wasn't actually struck from the books. So the Witchcraft Act was still on the books until 1951. Yes, it was still on the books. Now, it had fallen into disuse. I will put that out there. But it was still technically on the books. And they actually struck it from the books in 1951. So it took a long time for that to happen. I know there's like books on there, books out there about, silly laws that are still kind of on the books, right? Like you shall not wear a blue hat on Sundays or whatever it is. There are some silly ones, but this was a pretty serious one because this involved imprisonment if it was kind and death if it wasn't kind. You know what I mean? So in 1326 to 1330 AD, the church authorized the Inquisition to investigate witchcraft, and it developed what's called demonology, the theory of diabolical origin of the craft. The concept of witches as evil sorcerers was expanded at that time in the 1300s in 1326 to 1330 to include the belief that witches swore alliance to Satan and had sexual relations with the devil and kidnapped and ate children. And that was a real belief. They really believed witches ate children. So, crazy thoughts, right? Now, in 1450 AD, the first major witch hunts began in the West. The church created an imaginary evil religion using stereotypes that they had perpetuated, such as the devil and pitchforks and things like that. Historians have speculated that this religiously inspired genocide was motivated by a desire to attain a complete monopoly by the church. It was also a tool of repression to use to rein in nonconformist behavior. Basically, they used fear to make people do what they wanted to. And people that spoke out about it were deemed witches and thus punished. Now, 50 years later, in 1500 AD, during the 14th century, there had been 38 trials against witches and sorcerers in England, 95 in France, and 80 in Germany. As witch hunts accelerated, so we're getting into that, that decade of burning times, right? The 1500s were very high for witches being burned. So as those witch hunts accelerated, children's testimony was being deemed acceptable, and unlimited torture was also applied to obtain confessions. It was totally okay to do unlimited torture to get confessions, and the flimsiest circumstantial evidence was accepted as proof of guilt. They have this on record. In 1563 to 1580, several books were published at this time that protested against the witch hunts because they were getting a little out of control. This was not done on the grounds of religious or spiritual tolerance, but rather because this enlightened age, because we're coming out of the 60s, right? This is 1550 to 1560 was the high point, lots of burning time. That's the burning times. So in 1563, a few years after that, to the 80s of the 1500s, people were becoming more enlightened, and there was an encouragement of rational worldview, and that witchcraft was sort of seen as superstition. So a lot of the old folk remedies got lost because they were seen as superstition, but it did sort of start to quell the belief that witches were evil and that they should be put to death and persecuted and whatnot. So in 1684, so this is after the 1500s, right? 1684 to 1782, so almost 100 years later, the last accused witch was executed in 1684 in England. That's in England. So England actually stopped before everyone else did, where witches were not, you know, the last executed witch in England was in 1684. And then in Scotland, so I'll do them in order here. Yeah, so I'm doing them in order. So England came first, then Scotland. The last witch was burned in Scotland in 1727. And France stopped executing witches in 1745. Germany stopped executing witches in 1775. And Poland and Switzerland tie for the last witch killed in 1782. In fact, the last witch killed or executed was in Poland in 1782. She was hung, not burned. You know, like that makes a difference, but nevertheless. She was the last one, and it was by hanging. So the Salem witch trials, a lot of people think of the Salem witch trials and aren't sure exactly when they are or how they coincide. So 500 years after the witch trials started, so back in 975 when witch trials had started, when it was still just you have to fast or you might be imprisoned, you weren't being killed yet. So that's where that statement kind of comes from. It's starting at 975 when it became illegal to be a witch, sort of thing, right? So 500 years after that, the craze began in America. So in America, we're looking at 1692 when it first started. And that's when one of the most famous witch trials happened in 1692. There's 3 women that were accused by children, and they were spiteful accusations that led to their trials and their death. The first 3 women of Salem were accused of witchcraft and paved the way for many others to be accused as well. The first trial set the course for all subsequent ones, and then a type of mob rule took over. And then it kind of went down for a little bit, and then there was a second sort of wave of witch trials in Salem in the 17th century. So that's the 1600s. But there was sort of 2 in the 1600s. There was like a few years of witch trials, and then it went down, then another one kind of thing. And there was a lot of finger pointing. And like I said, there wasn't... it was more of a mob rule because there wasn't really an established government at that point. The Puritans were in charge. They were also in charge in England and stuff, and they were part of the movement against Catholics. And, you know, just like Protestants, you know, Protestants, Puritans, and Catholics were all kind of vying for power over in Europe, especially in England. And then it came to the New World, North America. And the thing with North America was there wasn't necessarily a firm government established in all these areas. So that's why, you know, it's just became a finger pointing session, and a lot of people died. You can read more about it in my booklet, innocently. So they weren't, you know, witches necessarily. However, there really are witches out there. I mean, when you talk about the burning times, you're often talking about women who knew medicine, women who were midwives, women who were healers. They didn't necessarily, they didn't title themselves witches or think of themselves as witches. They were women who cared, kind of thing. So now I get into the modern day witches, because now modern day witches do call themselves Wicca or witches or whatever. There is a difference between the two. I will talk about that in my introduction to witchcraft. The introduction will be a multi-part video series, because there's a lot of different parts to introduction to witchcraft, because even just this history is taking about an hour. But it's good to know where you're coming from. So what kind of happened was the church and Christianity sort of started to lose its vice grip hold on education and health. And like I said, there was a dawning of a new era sort of considered an enlightened era. Science became the way to think, a rational way to think, and that sort of thing. But the church did tolerate, during this time of enlightenment, Renaissance sorcery and Kabbalistic magic, providing it did not threaten the Christian worldview of good and evil. So not all forms of magic were faced persecution or hatred. Some styles did survive, and I have to say, sadly enough, they were often male-based kind of magic, as opposed to the healing energy and nature of a lot of the more practices practiced by women. So John Dee is a very famous guy. He's an alchemist, and he was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. So she's the queen that wanted tolerance. She was Protestant in her religion, but she wanted the burnings of Protestants and Catholics to stop. She wanted the violence between the two groups to stop. She wanted, she did impose fines on Catholics to go to Mass on Sunday. They didn't get the fine if they went to a Protestant service, but if they wanted to have a priest, then they would get a fine. And if Catholic families were hiding a priest, often they faced some kind of punishment, and often the priest was killed or executed. So she wanted tolerance, but she didn't always practice that. Now, part of that was, she didn't have full control over everyone, as one does not over a monarchy. But he, together with Edward Kelly and John Bacon, maybe you recognize those names, created a magic, and it was a magic form with angelic forces that, when summoned, would control demons to carry out the magician's will. So even though they were still kind of doing demonic work, and not that's what witchcraft or Wicca is about at all, but it's just kind of funny to me and sort of ironic that these men were allowed to control demons with angels using magic, and yet nothing happened to them, and they weren't accused of being heretics or witches or doing evil work. So just kind of a little ironic in what they would tolerate and not tolerate. But sorcery, alchemy, high magic are linked with the science of the age. So again, like I said in the introduction to witchcraft, I'm going to talk more about high magic and low magic in one of those parts. So the last actually witch to be convicted of witchcraft in England, her name was Jen Wenham, and she was executed in 1712. I believe that's the right year, right? Just looking back here, making sure I got my, 1684. And the hunts lasted much longer in Europe. Europe did carry them out. And remember I said that Polish woman, she was hung in 1782, and that was the last officially sanctioned execution for witchcraft on record. Doesn't mean other witches didn't die because of mob rule or whatever, but that was the last one on record in Europe. But despite the fact that logical thought was dispelling the ancient art as superstitious and nonsense, luckily the old ways did persist. And like I said, the Witchcraft Act in England was struck from the books in 1951. The Pagan Federation was formed at that point too, to protect people from persecution and to educate others. In the 21st century, Wicca remains the fastest growing religion in the West. Kind of interesting. And in 1954, you might recognize the name Gerald Gardner, who published Witchcraft Today. It's actually one of the first witchcraft books I ever read, some 30 years ago. And he is actually credited with being the founder of the religion Wicca. There is a difference. It's not the same as witchcraft. A lot of similarities, not the same thing. In England, Celtic practices plus Gardeners or Gardenias, you might have heard of Gardenia witches. They come from Gardner, who first published a book on witchcraft. after the Witchcraft Act was repealed. So in England, there's the Celtic, the Gardenia are blended, and they are what's now known as the British traditional witchcraft. So there's British traditional witchcraft. In the United States, Gardenia's ideas were brought in and sort of spread around by a guy named Raymond Buckland. Yeah, Buckland. I've read many of his books. His and Gardenia's books were 30 plus years ago, were some of the few that were actually available. It was really hard to get books when I first started studying witchcraft, and if you're a witch, you know you love books. You're a book lover by nature. So it's kind of interesting that how far we've come since then, and how many versions of a witch. And again, in Intro to Witchcraft, I will talk about the different types of witches, because there's lots now. Just to, you know, in this world, there's Wiccans, neo-pagans, witches, druids, shamans. There's ceremonial magic. There's voodoo and hoodoo and heathens and so much more. And like I said, in the introduction to witchcraft, I'm going to get into that more. But if you'd like the full version of A History of Witchcraft, because there is more in here than what I mentioned, I didn't want to take up too much of your time, although I have taken up a good chunk. But thank you for sticking around and watching this video and learning a little bit about the practice that you either are a part of or want to be a part of or want to know more about. So I hope you found this educational and somewhat entertaining. There were some ironies in history, as there always are. And if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos and get notifications about when the introduction to witchcraft videos go up. Again, thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate it. I hope you have a great day. Bye.